Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about It Chapter 2. Now, the thing with this part of the It story and the part 2 or chapter 2 or whatever it is with this narrative, the part where they're adults is not as good. And I think the interesting thing is despite the fact that they knew that nobody likes the part 2 of the TV miniseries, which really comes into play here since the book mixes up the two narratives a lot and is told very differently than either this movie and the TV movie. Just sort of weird that they choose to adapt it this way, but that's their thing, I guess. No one really likes part 2 or tape 2 for most people, since they didn't even see it on TV, of the It thing than the first one. I mean, it's always the lesser one. So you would think they would look at this kind of narrative and this reason for adapting it and all those things and think, hey, since we have 2 years, we'll figure out why does this suck so much and make it better. Now, it doesn't really suck that much, but they don't really do that at all. They kind of really do a straight kind of adaptation, playing off of what you know of it, which is probably one of the more well-known Stephen King stories. I have not read the book, I've just heard of the book, but they don't really give you a reason why they need to adapt it in this way. They don't really know what they're going to do with the adult side of it, because kids getting chased by a scary clown in a horror movie, hey, we're there, that's great. But when you get to the adult side of it, you have to maintain that kind of scariness, and the fact that this movie is, not as scary and isn't have a real reason for being this way. You kind of see more of the weaknesses in adapting a story like this rather than the strengths. Also, I don't think the other thing from my perspective is I was never in love with them. I'm sort of okay with them, really. I see them. I've seen both in theaters. I just watch them go over me, and then I go, yeah, that's certainly neat, and then I leave, and that's sort of it. And I don't really have as much of an attachment to this version of it, so when I watch it, I'm sort of I'm not really offended. It just doesn't instill that passion in me. And this one wasn't going to do that for even people who really did like the next one. But I think it speaks to Andy Muschietti, or how I view him, I guess. But I'm talking, so, that's definitely how this is going. I think it speaks to how Andy Muschietti is as a director, where he has interesting ideas. I definitely, don't disrespect him or think he's a hack or something like that. He's, a very talented, very good director, but he's not one who has enough pizzazz and use of camera and anything to truly blow you away. I feel like he's, it's sort of in him, but he doesn't want to let it out, or maybe he can't let it out, or maybe his talent only gets sort of close to that, and you never really get to see more. Because even in the action sequences towards the end, I kept wondering man, wouldn't it be cool if the camera was moving around and stuff, and he was really doing some tracking shots, and this felt really thrilling and scary, and I was oh, but it doesn't, because he shot it this particular way. Why? And I kept wondering why he did certain things, and it felt like he did them because he's well, that's what I'm supposed to do. When I watch a movie, I kind of want more of a theoretical reason than well, that's it's It Chapter 2, that's what I had to do. And that sort of goes throughout this whole movie. It feels like he had to do it this way. It is maybe too long. There are 6 different MacGuffins at one point in this movie and things like that. I could go through it. I didn't think it was a slog or anything like that. I know the length sort of bothers people. It did seem to constantly be on a mission, so it kind of grabs you in, but it's not really the charisma of the group as adults isn't there as much as it was for kids. They're separated, which is a good idea for only Empire Strikes Back, and everybody else usually sucks when they do that. And in here, it doesn't really work as well. A lot of the adults in this, Jessica Chastain gives kind of a weaker performance, especially for her. I don't know, she's going through a paycheck period, I guess. And then, McAvoy I actually kind of liked. He's a good character actor, to be honest, where he's usually underappreciated. I really like Bill Hader, but in general, I like Bill Hader in almost anything, as well as James Ransone, who I haven't seen in a while since The Wire. It never felt like everything kind of came together and gelled in that way that worked so well for the original film, but it felt like they weren't even really trying to do that, didn't have a passionate reason for why they did this movie this way. And in a lot of ways, you know, how in the book TV movie, it was like the 50s and then like the 80s or the 90s or whatever. And in this, it's like it started in the 80s and then went to the modern era, which I guess in the book and the TV movie that was still the modern era, but it was the modern era then or whatever. But in the 80s thing, they like changed the characters and made them more like kind of 80s-y, and it sort of like worked because you could tell they like, well, what would this character be like in the 80s? And they gave them specific 80s things and stuff. And that was cool. Like, they gave them a full fleshed out character. I totally knew who each of those people were because of like, hey, he has a Thundercats t-shirt, this kid likes New Kids on the Block, like simple stuff like that. And it was also kind of fun. And then you get to this movie and I'm like, oh, she's a fashion designer. What's her fashion design like? Never get a view of that. This guy writes books. Are they scary? Sorta, I guess. We're moving on. Bill Hader's a comedian. Wouldn't his character normally actually just be a shock jock? That seems like a better fit, to be honest. Who cares? We're not even going to talk about his comedy. We'll get vague references to it. And it would be cooler if they actually went, oh, well, he was a comedian, he was struggling, and he had like a podcast like Mark Maron, or he was a shock jock, and he like loved being this like big shock jock in that area. If you look at his humor, it sort of makes sense with that. Same with like the guy who like builds buildings. He's like, get out all the walls. I'm an architect. These walls feel like a prison. That's why I'm such a great architect, because prisons make people want to leave. Sure. I think that thing of like what they did with the characters in the kids, they didn't really do that with the adults. Like, they're so concerned with like the things with Pennywise and like the mythos of it and explaining where he came from, which, by the way, is like the worst part of any horror movie sequel. I really hate it when I find out, like, you know, the whole mythos of a killer. I don't want to know that shit. I want to be scared. I love the mystery. I love the suspense and the craziness of it. One of the reasons Midsummer worked so well earlier this year is because that shit was crazy. And it didn't make no sense. Even when you thought it made sense, it still made no sense. You're like, why are all these, like, what is going on with this sex scene? That's crazy. And like in It Chapter 2, they can't dwell in the, you know, crazy oddness of it. It just like kind of gets to a point where like, we're explaining everything and now we're literal, and there's a certain surrealness in not knowing. And particularly nowadays where you can basically, you know, sort of Google almost anything, not literally, but we do feel like we have the answer to almost anything as a society, or we can easily find out that answer or find someone who has that answer. And the idea of not having that information is horrifying in a lot of ways. And not being able to play with that is boring. Like, what's so scary? Like, you want these adults to deal with their past trauma, and it seems to like cut to like what happened that summer after they killed it, but clearly they didn't, because he was like fucking with them for the rest of the summer or something. They kept cutting to the kids, which seemed to be a way to like be like, hey, remember when you liked all these kids in this movie? Which they seem to like to do that a lot. Apparently they like shot with the kids and like de-aged them a little, which is creepy. It had some like leftover footage as well. That seemed to sort of be distracting in a ways, and it like just like padded out the runtime, because it felt like there were like too many things. Like, we got to find out how the Native Americans were involved and how it came from like outer space or whatever, which is, by the way, fucking stupid. This part of the story, I think, if Andy Muschietti, his greatest challenge was not making this a disappointment. And in a way, he fell in line to like what this is, because it's just like, that's how this narrative like goes, especially when you cut it up into two parts. I'd really like someone to do kind of more of a direct adaptation of the book, to be honest, because doing this thing that everyone gives credit to Corey Fukunaga for setting up when he was going to direct these two, but then he didn't. But really, he just ripped off what ABC TV did in like 1990, so whatever. Except, you know, it's in a movie theater and not on a TV, so, you know, he's a genius. But I think this was like as good as this was ever going to be, because it's just sort of a flawed narrative in itself. It's like, you're going to reveal too much about Pennywise. You're going to, you know, explain away him. Like, it almost felt like they explained so much and they went through so much mythos that they literally, like, when they were killing him, the movie was metaphorically killing him as well. If you know this story, you know where this is going to go, and where this goes is about. That's sort of it, you know. I keep saying that's sort of it, which I guess is true. Andy Muschietti, his name makes me semi-interested, but it's like, I feel like his movies make me semi-interested, where I'm like, oh, that's a germ of a cool idea. But like in this is maybe like of his 3 movies I've seen, this is probably definitely like his worst movie, and it shows his worst tendencies as a director, which is like kind of like not really theory wise thinking about an idea enough, because you know all the great directors, like he was mentored by Guillermo del Toro, he was given this huge opportunity by adapting it. He's like a competent, like smart, like kind of studio horror kind of big blockbuster sort of director, but he's not like really talking about anything. I think he thinks he's talking about stuff, but like he took it and made it more into like a big audience kind of all-encompassing thing. And although it is sort of about abuse and like how your childhood makes you and how childhood trauma makes you who you are and how your childhood makes you who you are, and plays within that whole idea, this doesn't really, it kind of like does that in a very literal way, but you can tell its real meat and bones of it is just frankly just like blankly telling this story because it blankly has to tell this story. But I don't think Andy Muschietti thought about why he has to tell this story, other than like, you know, this is a big movie assignment thing. I kind of question him as a director who we're going to take all that seriously, because although he's like a very good, competent, like sort of studio director, I don't really find him to be more than that, and I don't really see more than that within this. I think Mama might have been the more interesting. The first It kind of had some promise in it, but this one just shows somebody who like was trying to appease too many people, was trying to fix this thing in kind of really lame ways by like having too much of the loser's kids, trying to explain too much, really not thinking on his instincts as a horror director, making this flawed narrative somehow work with all this nonsense. And it just doesn't, you know. It's fine, it's entertaining, it's not like the worst thing in the world. I think the reviews are frankly a little too negative, because they should have realistically known what they were getting. If you knew what you were getting out of a part 2, this is probably about as good as chapter 2 could have been. But I think maybe the problem is like he should have tried to do more with it. He should have probably excelled and made part 2 into something so cool that we wouldn't go, oh hey, you know, it sort of runs out of steam after like the kids are older and all that. It sort of like kind of sucks at that point. And he didn't look at that as it sucks. He looked at it as like, I have to somehow make the story interesting. And he didn't think about like why and the how and the theory of it. And then in It Chapter 2 kind of falls apart, and you could say just sort of floats away and sort of is what it is. And that's sort of all it is, that floats away as we wait for someone to make the complete faithful adaptation of it, hopefully in around 27 years or so. So if you have seen It Chapter 2 and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.